Hello everyone, hope you're all fine and safe at home. Before we start, Bilal, wake up, don't sleep. Nurhan, I hope you're studying. And please, if you may send the PDF files from the ones you gave me to your friends. Let's start. We're gonna move on to Unit 2 after we finished Unit 1, which was the nutrition. Unit 2 is about neurobiology, human behavior, and health. So basically, if I throw a ball at one of you, you're gonna catch it. This is a reaction, okay? A reaction is a response to a stimuli, to a change that's occurring in the environment. If we talk about the human reactions, we've got the reflexes, we've got voluntary reactions, and we've got acquired reactions. The reflexes are reactions present since birth. For example, if you place your finger in the open palm of a baby, what will he do? He'll directly close it. This is a reflex, okay? It's not something that he learned. It's simply a reflex. Okay, we go to the voluntary ones, which are reactions chosen and decided for by the individual. You decide if you want to stand up and walk. You decide if you want to remove your hand upon touching something hot. So this is a voluntary reaction. Acquired reactions are reactions that you start doing because you learn. You learn them, okay? So you learn that you have to read and understand something. This is acquired. So all reactions require an exchange of signals. We need to have a communication between different cells and or different organs in order for a reaction to occur. We need communication, for example, between your hands and the brain in order for you to hold a ball or in order for you to catch a ball. Let's move on now to chapter 1. Open your books to page 57 and follow along. So chapter 1 is basically about a neural communication. So what's the function of the nervous system or the neural communication? Basically, it has 3 different functions: the sensory function, the integrative function, and the motor function. Sensory function, just as the name suggests, it has to do with the senses. So it detects a change. It shows that it understands that there is a change, whether it was inside the body or outside the body. If it's inside the body, we call it internal. Let's say, okay, you're going to learn about it later on. External, which comes from outside the body, like throwing the ball to one of you and then you catching it. Integrative function, which means it will analyze the change that's happening. It's an analysis of sensory information. It will understand what this change is and decide what's going to happen. And finally, the motor function, which is the reaction to the stimulation, okay? So let's say I throw a ball. Well, how will you know that I'm throwing it? Through the sensory function of the nervous system, through your eyes, okay? You sense it. And then it sends a message to the brain, and then we have the integrative function, which analyzes this sensory information and decides that you're supposed to catch the ball. And finally, this decision is sent to a muscle, for example, and we've got the motor reaction, which reacts to the throwing of the ball, which was the stimulation. Let's go now to document 1. Book page 58, the nervous system, an organized network. It's really very organized and very complicated. It's not complicated as in complicated, but it's really organized. So if I want to divide the nervous system into 2 parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the central nervous system includes the spinal cord and the brain, or what's known in science as encephalon. The encephalon, the brain, your brain, is divided into 3 parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the cerebrum is the hugest part, and it's the one responsible for sensing stuff and motor activity. The medulla oblongata is directly connected to the spinal cord, and the cerebellum is the back part of the brain, okay, and it's responsible for balance. I'll show you the picture present on page 58. So this is the structure of the nervous system. We have the central nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then we've got the peripheral nervous system, which includes all the other nerves and the receptors. Okay, moving on to the neuron, or the cells of the nervous system. We have two major cells of the nervous system. We've got the neuron and the neuroglial cells. So the neurons are the ones responsible for the transmission of messages. The neuroglial cells are basically support cells. They support them, okay? What is the neuron? This is the basic structure of the nervous cell or the neuron. We've got a cell body, axon, terminal arborization, and dendrites. Okay? So the cell body contains the nucleus, which is the brain of the cell. The dendrites and the axon are cytoplasmic extensions. The cytoplasm is the jelly-like substance that everything sticks in, okay? The dendrites receive the message, while the message goes through the cell body, travels through the axon to the terminal arborization, and it jumps, and I'm repeating, jumps to another nervous cell or another neuron. So again, the neuron is made up of cell body and axon, and dendrites, and terminal arborization. Basically, the axon and dendrites are cytoplasmic extensions. The cell body contains the nucleus, and we've got terminal arborizations and the synaptic knob where the synapses occur. We're going to learn about the synapse. So, some cells are covered by a myelin sheath. This myelin sheath is lipid basically, and it envelopes the axon. It's formed of lipids or fats. We've already spoken about lipids in Unit 1, so you're supposed to know what they are. The myelin sheath is later protected by another cell, which is known as the Schwann cells. You see these little empty spaces between one Schwann cell and the other? These are known as the node of Ranvier. You're going to learn their function later on. So this is if I want to show you the basic structure of a neuron. Now, I could divide the neurons because not all our neurons are the same. Okay? So if I want to divide the neuron depending on the extension coming out from the cell body, remember we said we've got the dendrites and we've got the axons. Okay, some neurons have only one extension coming out, like this one over here. You see the extension coming out? It's only one, and we call it unipolar. Another neuron would have two extensions coming out, 1, 2, and we call it bipolar. So unipolar for one extension coming out from the cell body, bipolar for two extensions coming out of the cell body. And as you could see, the tree, my drawing is still horrible. As you could see, the tree are a lot of extensions coming out. We call it multipolar. So again, if I want to divide the neurons according to how many extension or how many things coming out of the cell body, I could divide it into unipolar with one extension coming out, bipolar with two extensions coming out, or multipolar with several extensions coming out. Now, if I want to divide the neurons based on the function, what do? What's the job of this neuron in specific? Some of them receive information from receptors. Let's say you put your hand on a hot object. So you put your hand on a hot object. Who will receive that this object is hot? A sensory neuron. Okay? A sensory neuron would receive it and sends it to the central nervous system, which is the brain. And another name for this sensory neuron is known as afferent neuron. So again, if I want to divide the neurons according to the extensions, I would have unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. If I want to divide the neurons according to the function or the job they do, I would divide them into sensory, association or interneuron, and motor neuron. And just like the name tells you, sensory senses the stuff, okay? And sends the information to the central nervous system in a centripetal direction. The association or interneurons, they receive the message. They are found in the CNS or the central nervous system. So I would find interneurons in the brain and the spinal cord. They receive the message from the sensory neuron and conducts them. Okay, so they try to understand what's going on and sends a message finally to the motor neuron. So the motor neuron take this message from the interneuron, from the central nervous system, to an effector organ. Okay, this is why we call it an efferent neuron, and we call the direction the message travel in centrifugal direction. I will repeat. So I receive through sensory neurons, I integrate or understand the message in my brain through interneurons, and finally send it to the motor neuron, and from the motor neuron it would go to an effector organ. Let's say, for example, this organ is a muscle, to tell your hand to remove, to ask your hand to remove. So we call the motor neuron efferent neuron. These are only other names. So sensory neuron is also called afferent, while motor neuron is also called efferent neuron. The direction of the message would be centripetal in the sensory, and in the motor would be centrifugal direction. So these are the some type of neurons present in our body. They're present on book page 58. This is the unipolar one. It's found in the spinal cord. The bipolar one is found in the retina of your eye. This is a multipolar one, and this is again a multipolar one. They're present in the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. Again, cerebral meaning brain. Okay. The last thing you need to know is that some neurons are myelinated. They have a myelin sheath, while other neurons are not myelinated. What's the function of the myelin sheath? You'll know in a couple of minutes. One more thing. Now remember we said that the neuron is made of a cell body and axon. So some axons join together in fascicles to form the nerve. You see this over here? This is all axons, and this is what we call nerve. Let's move to book page 59. Look at this picture, a simple communication network. Most of the networks are, however, more complex. Let's start. So we start with the receptor, which is the skin. Who will sense a change? The sensory neuron. The sensory neuron will send the message to the spinal cord. The spinal cord, again, is the central nervous system. What will happen in the spinal cord? The interneuron will receive the message and integrate it or conduct it, and then will send different information to the motor neuron. Let's say, for example, it will tell the muscle to twitch in order to remove the hand. So the message travels through the motor neuron to an effector, which is the muscle, and we will have a reaction. Deal? So we've got a stimulus, which is received by a receptor organ. The receptor organ sends it to the central nervous system through what? Through a sensory neuron, and this is known as the sensory pathway. The central nervous system, in the central nervous system, we've got the interneurons, which receive the information and integrate it and decides upon the proper action. After that, it travels to the effector organ, which is, how does it travel? Through a motor neuron, okay? And the effector organ will receive the decision to perform an action or stop an action. And finally, we've got an action. Again, we start with a stimulus or a change in the environment, whether internal or external. Who receives it? The receptor organ. The receptor organ sends this change to the central nervous system through a sensory neuron. So over here, this arrow is supposed to be a sensory neuron. And the central nervous system receives the information, analyzes it, decides what's going to happen, and then sends it to the effector organ. Does it send it through a sensory neuron? No. Over here, we're going to have a motor neuron. So we receive the stimulus through the receptor organ. We send the message through a sensory neuron to the central nervous system. In the central nervous system, we've got the interneurons, which decide what's going to happen, and then sends a message to the effector organ through a motor neuron, and then we've got an action. So to change my stimulus into an action, I need to receive it, send it to the nervous system, central nervous system, and then send it to an effector organ, okay? That's it for document 1. We're gonna move on to document 2. So we're gonna move to document 2. The title is Nervous Information, Nature and Propagation. What's the nature of the nervous information? Is it a letter? Yalla, we're gonna write a letter. Hala, the central nervous system will know what to do. No. There is a change that occurs in the neuron. So usually when the neuron is resting, so there's no stimulus, or we call this a non-stimulated neuron, it has a resting potential or a membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts. Why is it negative 70? Because we've got sodium and potassium ions. So we've got sodium and potassium ions. Usually when there's no stimulus, the sodium predominates, or it's present inside the cell more than outside, and thus gives it the negative 70 millivolt charge. So let's say a stimulus occurred. If a stimulus occurs, we're going to have what's known as the action potential, okay? Which means I'm going to have a depolarization from negative 70 millivolts to plus 30 millivolts. So if you look at figure 2.10, you see how this neuron is at negative 70 millivolts, so I know that this is resting. There's no stimulus, there's no reaction, there's no nervous message moving. So what we can conclude is that the nervous message is what? Electrical. So let's see, negative 70, and action potential occurs, so it moves from negative 70 to plus 30. This movement from negative 70 to plus 30 is known as depolarization, okay? So then after the message moves on, we have repolarization, and the neuron is returning to its original stage, which is negative 70 millivolts. So we start at negative 70. We know this as the resting potential. If we have an action potential, we move up to plus 30 millivolt, and then when the message moves on, we return to negative 70 millivolts. What's the title? So we start with the resting state at negative 70 millivolt. An action potential occurs. We have depolarization. Instead of negative 70, the Na move in at a very high, So at resting potential, we've got the sodium outside more than inside. This is why it's larger. Outside than inside. But at depolarization, the sodium starts going in at very high level, and it changes the potential of the neuron from negative 70 to positive 30. After the message passes by, we've got what's known as repolarization. We've got potassium ions going outside at very high speed, and thus it returns to the resting potential, okay? So the terms you need to know so far are the resting potential and the action potential. The resting potential is the potential difference due to membrane polarization of a nerve fiber, unequal distribution of ions between intracellular and extracellular medium. We said it's sodium and potassium. The action potential is a very rapid change in the membrane potential that occurs when the nerve cell is effectively stimulated. Now you need to know something, that a stimulus can come from different sources. It could be mechanical, chemical, thermal, and light. Light is stimulus, just like the name says, it's light intensity. Let's say you cover your eyes because of the sun. What receives? The type of receptor that receives that stimulus is known as photoreceptor. Okay, it sends it to the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron takes it to the interneuron, from the interneuron to the motor neuron, and tells you to put your hand over your eyes. The thermal stimulus it has to do with hot and cold. The type of receptor or temperature. So thermal stimulus have to do with temperature. The type of receptor that receives it are known as thermoreceptors. Chemical stimulus, dilute HCl, okay? So chemicals. The type of receptor that receives it is the chemoreceptors. And finally, we've got the mechanical receptors, and these are known as the ones that These are the stimulus that have to do with the pressure, shock, or hit. Let's say someone comes and slaps you. Who receives it? The mechanoreceptors, okay? Because it's a mechanical stimulus. Let's move on to the next page, the conduction of the message. So in order for a message to be conducted, we need a specific threshold to be reached, which is plus 30 if I'm not mistaken. Okay, if this threshold is not received, there will be no action potential, there will be no message, there will be no nervous message. And once it's done, once this message moves on, there is no turning back. So the threshold intensity, or TI, of stimulation, it is the minimum intensity of a certain stimulus that stimulates a receptor and elaborates a nervous message. So this stimulus has to be strong enough to reach the threshold intensity. If it reaches it, it generates AP, action potential. Below this value, the stimulus is ineffective and I will have no action potential. Okay, so we know that the nervous message goes in one direction, or it is unidirectional. So it starts with the dendrites, moves to the cell body, from there to the axon, from the axon to the terminal arborization, and finally it travels to another neuron. This neuron could be an interneuron if this is a sensory neuron, or it could be a motor neuron if this message is traveling through an interneuron. Now the speed of propagation is determined by two things: the external factors and the internal factor. Let's say you're on medicines or drugs that makes you relax. The nervous message would not be traveling as fast as when you're normal, you're not taking any drugs. The internal factors include the diameter of the nerve fiber, or how huge something the fiber is, the axon is. And the second thing is the myelination. Remember the myelin sheath, the one formed from the lipids? So let's talk about the diameter of the nerve fiber. As the diameter increases, the speed of the nervous message at the level of a nerve fiber increases. So the bigger the fiber is, the faster the nervous message travels. Myelination. The speed of the nervous message in a myelinated nerve fiber is faster than that in a non-myelinated nerve fiber. Look over here. Remember this? This is myelinated. So let's say this is a neuron that has a message. So it will be received by the dendrites and it travel. How will it travel in the axon? If it's myelinated, it will only jump in the node of Ranvier and thus reaches the terminal arborization faster. If it is not myelinated, it will travel throughout the axon. So again, if it's myelinated, it will only jump. Okay? So it will be faster. But if it's not myelinated, it will have to travel the whole length of the axon. So these are the internal factors. We move to the last thing, low of all or none. Either there is no action potential or there is an action potential, okay? So it doesn't matter how much the intensity of the stimulus is, if it will either generate an action potential or not to generate an action potential. So it depends on how many action potentials I have and not on the amplitude, on how high the action potential is. If you look at your book on page figure 11.2, I don't care how high my action potential is as long as an action potential is generated. How many action potentials I have. This is a figure from an oscilloscope. So over here I've got two action potentials. Look over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So more than two definitely. So this would be, the intensity would be larger and so on. So it doesn't depend on how high it goes as much as it depends on how many action potentials I have. This is it for this week. I hope you understood it. Try your best to study. Next week we're going to be continuing, finishing the chapter actually. Hope you understood it. Stay at home and stay safe.